We build each week in our annual cycle of reading the Torah, from the beginning of Bereshit, as we read the first chapter last week with creation, up to our ancestors returning to the promised land with the last chapter of Devarim. There are chapters, yes, that are especially devoted to laws. A number of chapters are a retelling of some of our stories and, of course, lessons. But as we have just begun, the focus now is particularly on sharing the foundation of our history. Last week, we read of the first 10 generations of human existence on earth, from Adam to Noach. This week, we will read of another 10 generations, from Noach to Avraham, or Avram. This week, as we tell the story of Noach, his story is actually told more in comparison to the world around him than about Noach himself. Noach ish sadik tamid haya bedorotav. Noah was a righteous and blameless man in his generation. It is not that Noach was the epitome of righteousness, but compared to those around him, in his generation, he positively stood out. Of course, we should all do good for the sake of doing good. We should all do right because it is what is right. But sometimes we may not be as compared to the ideal as should be. Sometimes we are compared to those around us. We are seen for the times in which we live. To be righteous for a particular time does not necessarily mean to actually be righteous. To be righteous compared to one's peers does not necessarily mean to actually be righteous. There is always the ideal towards which we should strive. But then there is the real in which we live. I do encourage us all to strive as strongly as can be for the ideal. But at a minimum, at least let's be better than the norms of with whom and when we exist. That was the case of Noah. He was not saved because he was the epitome of righteousness, but he was at least the most righteous there was then and there. When he lived, as the parashah states, Vatishachet haaretz, and the earth was corrupt. It was a time of warped values. It was a time lacking of morality. And thus Noah stood out positively, at least compared to that. And thus I encourage us all to at least strive to be better than the norms of our times. We should not just be as others are. We should not just accept that this is how things must be. It is said that every generation should do better than the one before. We should be progressing, not regressing. It is time we turn this around, as had honorable generations before. Parshat Noach, though, is not just about the story of Noah. It begins with Noah. It compares him to the world around him. It has him build an ark as instructed by God. It has him save his own family and save male and female of the multitude of land and air and sea animals that they may repopulate the earth. After the story of the great flood and the dove flying from the ark and returning with the olive leaf, and the sign of the rainbow and God's promise that he would never destroy so completely again. Does that mean that the times then were so much worse than later times, like even now? Not necessarily. But God has given us the power of choice, and we are to so live with consequences, good or bad, based on how we so choose. Throughout this reading, we are sparked to ponder Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, our inclination to do evil and our inclination to do good. God realizes our ill inclinations and our weakness. That is why, after the flood, God even gives in and allows us to eat animals. It is clear in the Torah that that is not the ideal, and we are never commanded that we must eat meat, but we are given the concession and allowed to eat meat due to our grave weakness and our ill inclinations. This parsha builds through the life of Noah, even to his drinking irresponsibly, and his son Ham's warped values and warped humor. And we are to learn lessons from this. This is to be a lesson to mankind about overindulgence leading to drunkenness. We are not to drink irresponsibly. We are not to lose control of ourselves. We are not to take advantage of those who do lose control. And we are to always honor our parents and to always treat them rightly with respect. Children have a responsibility to do right by their parents, and even if the parents so err. There is also the lesson here, especially when looking at Noah's children, Ham, Yafet, and Shem, that parents can have multiple children who can be quite different from each other, even in our efforts to raise them all right the same. Parents should set a good example for all of our children and teach them all well, but children can still make their own choices for good or for bad, just as such is so with all of God's children. But then their choices can affect their children and future generations. The Torah is not provided as a fairy tale with everything done right and everything done good. It serves to provide us stories from whence we came, from which we are supposed to learn. We are not to repeat the mistakes of the past. We are supposed to learn from them. We are supposed to learn more and better each generation. Each generation should be better, not worse. We should be moving forward, not backward. But we must learn the past. We must learn the lessons of the past. Our history is our history. We should learn from where we came to better figure out where we are going. Even if the masses seem to be living life and leading life in a certain direction, that does not mean that they are right. We are challenged, despite what others are doing, to be more good, to do more good, to bring more good into this world. It can be especially quite challenging, though, when the masses are going in the wrong direction. And such can particularly be learned from the story of the Tower of Babel, the gate of God, which then takes place in this parsha towards the end of Noach's life. The people seem to come together, which surely could be a good thing. But coming together is good if we are coming together for good. If though our coming together is not for the good, then our coming together is not good. We were spread across the earth and with different languages because we tried to come together for ill purpose. We were trying to come together for ourselves and not for God. Thus, how wonderful it could be if we all came together truly for good and for God. But just because we come together does not make it good or right. This parsha of Noach builds through so many lessons for us to learn for our lives. It builds through Noach's life, through good and not good, and builds to the story of the Tower of Babel, and towards our being separated further until we can come together better. That is what we should be aspiring to. Coming together for good, coming together for God, and not coming together for our own ulterior motives. And thus, time passes. Time passes, events happen. Time passes, events happen. And time passes, and events happen. Certainly, plenty happens every day and throughout all of our history. But it is the most notable that we remember, upon which we focus. And the stories of the Torah are thus here for a reason. For us to learn from the past for the sake of a better future. These are the stories of our past. These are the foundations of our existence. We must not deny the past, but we must learn from it, despite what others before us have done. And despite what others around us are doing, we need to choose more consciously and more carefully. Regardless, we are heading into a future. But are we choosing to be heading into the best possible future that we can? Just as last week's reading took us through 10 generations from the time of Adam to the time of Noach, this week's reading takes us through the next 10 generations from the time of Noach to the time of Avram. But with that, we will begin next week. And for now, the Shabbat Shalom.